Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament.
It's allowed.
You should keep that one in there. The Old Testament. Take two. Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament Lectionary podcast. I'm Reverend Dr. Rachel Wren, and I teach biblical studies at Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University in Ohio. This week, we have a special treat. We've got a guest host filling in for Rosie and Tim. Paul Essah is a PhD student in the wonderful Hebrew Bible program at Yale University. You'll hear from his voice that he's not a native of New Haven, Connecticut. Paul is actually from Ghana in West Africa, but has been doing his graduate education in the United States. Paul is a really smart scholar and a wonderful human being, and we are so happy to have you with us, Paul, and excited to hear about your insights on the first reading this week.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome. So the first reading for January 29th is Micah 6, 1 through 8. And that's kind of a bumper sticker excerpt from Micah, at least that verse 8 is pretty famous. So where are you going to go with this one?
Well, let's begin right there, the Micah chapter 6, verse 8 passage. Then we will zoom out to look at what came right before it and after it, then even wider to look briefly at the book as a whole. So the text itself reads this way. It says, "He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God."
So
For
pretty.
passages like this, I like to pay attention first to who is speaking, who is being spoken to, and what is being said. So first, who is speaking? Note that the whole thing is a reportage. As all prophetic messages, there is a prophet who does the speaking on behalf of the deity. Here, Micah is speaking on behalf of an anonymous he, which we can bet for many reasons is God. Then to whom? To Adam, to humans, humanity, or mortals. But that is only what the immediate literary context suggests. Just a little after verse 8, the entire city of Judah is mentioned. That is, verse 9 of chapter 6. And the wealthy of Judah too is mentioned in verse 12 of chapter 6. Even before that, my people, maybe all of Judahites or Israelites, not very clear. They are also mentioned in verse 3. So looking broadly through the entirety of the book, different messages are given to different people. But the recurring recipients are Judah's political and religious leaders.
Oh, I think that's a point that we cannot emphasize enough. I think there's a wonderful tendency to take the Bible, especially the prophetic text, and read it as to us as individuals in relationship with God. But they really carry so much more depth and richness when we keep in mind that original context of the leadership, the political and the religious leadership. So
That's right.
Great first point. What do you want to say about what is said to those folks?
Well, two things. So it's what is good and what God requires of Adam. Good here is the word tov. It is used here to point to like ethical deeds than it is of descriptive, things like, what is nice aesthetically. And what is required is from the word, requires is from the word doresh. It's a participle from the root darash, which means to seek or search or to require of Adam. So what good exactly is required? The later half of the passage points to those things. And those things are justice, love, which is really hesed. And I'll talk about that in a minute.
Nice.
And to walk with your God in humility. So let me highlight each one a little bit. Justice, which is from the word mishpat, is a very common Hebrew word, especially in prophetic literature. It appears somewhere close to 500 times in biblical Hebrew, and about half of that is within the prophetic corpus.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's amazing.
Yeah. It means something like acting for equity and for what is fair on behalf of the most vulnerable and exploited of society.
Yeah.
Now, that is not just an acknowledgement of what is right, but an active involvement in fixing what is wrong in the first place.
Nice.
Often mishpat is followed by another very popular word in biblical Hebrew or Hebrew prophecy in general, which is tzedek, right? Righteousness. But here, we don't see tzedek. We don't see that. Instead, we see another truly unique word, which is chesed. The NRSV chooses kindness for it. But chesed really means something like a cocktail, a blend of, love, loyalty, and kindness.
A cocktail. That's a fantastic way to describe chesed, because you can't drink a cocktail without all of its component pieces, right?
Exactly.
But when you put them all together, it's something more than just the addition of all the singular parts. So
Sure.
A cocktail of love, loyalty, and kindness. I'd drink that one. That sounds amazing.
Awesome.
So what about the walking with God humbly part?
Well, I love biblical imagery. And the phrase to walk humbly with God evokes an image of a literal walking with God in, say, like a garden, holding hands, and so on and so forth. But it truly represents a relationship with God. Even more fascinating is the requirement for humility. And the word for that is tana, right? It's a very rare, let me go back again. Even more fascinating is the requirement for humility. And the word for that is tana. Tana is a very rare biblical Hebrew word. It appears just twice in biblical Hebrew, here in Micah and in Proverbs. In Proverbs, it refers to a group of people who, because of their lowly, simple, humble way of living, they possess chokmah, which is another popular word in Proverbs, wisdom. And so suddenly, tana, humility here, is used antithetically to haughtiness and pride.
Nice. And again, if you're keeping in mind to whom this is speaking, this is addressing, it makes that point so much more important, doesn't it? Because
That's right.
If the point of verse 8 is that, according to the prophet Micah, God expects from Judah's religious and political leaders what is tov, what is good. Yet what is good is not up to them to decide. It is defined by God. And that is justice, chesed, and a humble walk with God in the garden.
That's right. Note, though, that verse 8 is a question. It's a rhetorical question. In other words, a question to which an answer is not expected. So my good guess is that these divine requirements are not entirely new to this community. They know or should know from past interactions with God. This really is only but a stern reminder.
Yeah.
And speaking of rhetorical questions, it begins from verse 6.
Yeah. Okay. So if we back up then, verses 6 to 7 is the section with all the questions about how to come before God or how do you approach God. And it lists some interesting options. Number 1, is it with the most pleasing burnt offering? Number 2, a young calf. Number 3, 1,000 rams. Number 4, huge dams of oil. Or number 5, a firstborn child.
That's right.
Interesting.
Yep. The firstborn child thing is weird. It perhaps signals that some people in ancient Judah thought that sacrificing a firstborn child on a literal altar to God was acceptable, just as their neighbors did to their gods. But we don't have time to get into all that jazz. But you're right, Rachel. Verse 6 to 7 seems a lot like, trivia on Torah, construed in a liturgical format, right?
Jeopardy, biblical Jeopardy.
Biblical Jeopardy, that's right. With all these questions, it is expected that anyone living in Judah at the time should know the answer to, some of these questions, which is like, how do you come before God? Again, they aren't questions inviting a response, but rather provoking a thought to action. More importantly, these preceding questions situate verse 8 within a literary context that highlights its meaning a lot better, right? Which is, far from a ritualistic display of piety before God, is the need for justice, for chesed, in a humble walk with God.
Yeah. And I think that's also a place where it can be helpful to remember the context of these letters, because I think so often these verses have been taken and tried to juxtapose ritualistic piety versus a kind of an intentional heart love of God, which is, our typical, or at least my typical tradition's Protestant way of doing it. But I think when you read the broader context of these prophets, it's like, no. Those rituals were being used in order to violate Torah and in order to take advantage of people. So it's not that one is better than the other. It's that God says, do not use my perfect good Torah in order to violate the Torah itself, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. But let's step out of chapter 6 for a minute. A message like this always signals a bigger, social political problem, as we, began to allude to. Yeah. And surely this was the case in Judah at the time of Micah's prophecy. Although God cares about ritual and piety, it looks as though in prophetic literature broadly, the focus is more on the way people live with each other, and especially for leaders, how they use power.
Yeah.
Remember, Micah is one of the 4 great 8th century prophets. All 4 of them centered their message on exposing injustice and inequity. Because Micah was from among the people, a rural peasant himself, he was able to see and understand the pressuring effects of the policies, the leaders of his time, and he sternly confronted them with prophetic passion.
So prophecy on behalf of the people by one who is from the people themselves, right?
Yeah.
That's a really beautiful example of the power of representation, of perspective, and of speaking as one who has experienced what the vulnerable in society have experienced themselves.
That's right. That's right.
Wonderful. So, okay, how would you suggest people preach this? What are some angles you might suggest?
So for a famous passage like this, there's a lot. There's a lot that can be said. There's a lot that has already been said, some of which we have highlighted, obviously. The message of justice is very key, so I wouldn't escape that. Also, the juxtaposition of religious piety versus the emphasis on social justice, on hesed, and a humble relationship with God is truly powerful. Yet, if I were to preach this passage among my people, knowing all the things that I know about them, I would draw on Micah's life and prophetic work to clarify what prophecy is, what it is not, and what it does. This is important because for many, prophecy is this deeply spiritual way of accessing hidden knowledge from God. Knowledge that, when reached, help solve all of our problems in an instant, right? They use prophecy as a tool to dissolve uncertainty in life. And you know how we humans are so obsessed with being in control and knowing all things. We want to know the future of our finances, whether we will have children or not, whether or not our favorite political leader will win the election, that kind of thing. And we use prophecy for these kinds of things, performed with a huge emphasis on knowing. I see this and I see that. This is going to happen. No doubt that other parts of the Bible have definitions of prophecy that leans towards revelation of the future. But in this sense, and indeed prophecy as the majority of the Hebrew Bible expounds, is less about knowing all things and more about being a God-sent critic. Bob Wilson, who taught biblical prophecy here at Yale for many years, he thought that prophetic literature or prophetic texts are through and through texts that deal with society. It's about analyzing society, the social, cultural, political, economic dimensions of it, and calling out existing policies, practices, and systems, etc., that perpetuate unfairness and injustice. Like Micah, prophecy is a fearless speech on behalf of the most vulnerable of society. That is certainly not the safest job on earth because, this kind of thing attracts a lot of enemies, attracts a lot of threats. In our day, it would attract a lot of social media attention from people with power. But that risk is exactly what Micah exemplifies and invites us to. So I hope that preachers out there, among all that could be said about this passage, will take the chance to shed some light on what prophecy is and what it is not.
Oh, yeah. I think that's a beautiful way to use this text, especially one that's so familiar, and has been used to really talk about my relationship with God, but to broaden that, to let it kind of breathe a little bit. Well, that seems like a great place to end for this week. Paul, thanks so much for jumping in and giving us such a helpful take on a famous text.
You're welcome, Rachel. I really enjoyed the conversation.
I did too. This was awesome. Friends, that'll do it for First Reading this week. Remember that you can find an episode on many of the past episodes, well, all of the past episodes in the lectionary and some extras just because we're fun. Use our search box on our website, firstreadingpodcast.com. While you're there, poke around a little bit. We've got some merchandise. We've got a nice big donate button that will help us keep the podcast going. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get podcasts, and we would really appreciate it if you could take just 30 seconds, leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you find us. That helps us get the word out to new listeners, to grow our community. And of course, if your grandma needs something to do, share this episode with her. You know she would love it. Thanks for taking the time to do that. Until next time, I'm Rachel Wren.
And I'm Paul Essah. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week.